Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Jay McDaniel, and I'm representing the Cobb Institute, a community for process and practice. It's based in Claremont, California, but has members all over the United States and all over the world. And one of its objectives is to foster discussions on important topics. And that's what we have tonight. We have a very important topic. Wherever you are, you know that the United States is a religiously polarized nation. And the religious polarization is often accompanied by political polarization. And that's what we want to talk about tonight. We really want to talk about what Christians can do as Christians to help resolve some of those issues and help us move toward a more just and sustainable nation and world. And we have two thinkers with us, two prominent theologians who've thought about these matters deeply, Dr. John Sanders and Dr. John Cobb. And I'd like to just point you in the direction of some books of theirs that you'll see on your screen. There on the left, you see two books by John Cobb, Jesus is Abba, the God who has not failed, and Salvation, Jesus' mission and ours. And on the right, you'll see two books by John Sanders, Embracing Prodigals, Overcoming Authoritative Religion by Embodying Jesus' Nurturing Grace, and The God Who Risks, A Theology of Divine Providence. Both John Cobb and John Sanders believe in a God for whom the future is open and a God of nurturance. And John Sanders in particular has done a good bit of research on what divides people over this issue of a nurturant Christianity versus an authoritative Christianity. So I've asked him to go first and simply address the question, how do you understand a nurturant Christianity and why does it matter to you? John, please proceed.
Thank you, Jay. So one of the things that I noticed, particularly in the last 15 years, is how much every book I wrote, every time I made a presentation, the same group of people would blast it and say all kinds of harsh things about it. And I was like, why? It doesn't matter what topic I write on. They still, sharply criticize it. And I began doing research in the social sciences and finding out that political scientists, sociologists, psychologists use what are called two cognitive models. It's not that everyone uses these, but they use these two models. And there's different names for them. So I call them authoritative and nurturant, but other names for the authoritative are authoritarian and strict father. Other names for nurturant are benevolent. They also, some researchers use the terms tight and loose. And there's one other I can't think of right now. But so nobody uses exactly the same terms to describe these two models. But there's a tremendous amount of agreement about the two models. And when I was reading about this, I said, oh, I think this explains a ton of what I have experienced in my own life in both church settings and in theology, academic settings as well. And so I began writing this book in order to explain this. Much of this research is applied, that I was reading, is applied to people in the United States, but in every country around the world. There is a study called the World Values Survey, and they look at these two groups in cultures and religions all over the world. So it's not just Christianity, it's not just America. You can find the same things in Hungary. You can find them in Egypt. You certainly find them in modern day Turkey and even India with Prime Minister Modi and his nationalistic Hinduism. So it's not just Christianity, but I'm a Christian theologian, I'm an American, so I focused on American Christianity. So what I do in the book is set out the two sets of values that each side lives by, and then I apply them to a number of theological and religious topics such as Jesus, God, atonement, salvation, sin, the nature of the Bible and how Christians use the Bible. What about divine judgment? And morality. How do we even think about morality? The two sides differ on that. And then finally, I have a chapter on religious politics, talking about income inequality, healthcare, race, things like that. So first, now, with that brief introduction, let me tell you a little bit about the two models so we have them in mind. And again, there's various names for them. Not everyone agrees on the names, but the models are pretty well established in the research. So nurturants believe that the core to life is about building relationships and community. It's about living together. It's interdependence. They highly value virtues such as empathy, cooperation, and perspective taking. That is, being able to think inside of somebody else's shoes. To use the old proverb, to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. Think about their experiences and how they believe. Not that you agree with them necessarily, but that you can understand them. For me, I see this in the Christian doctrine of incarnation, that God walks in our shoes, takes on our perspective. Some other aspects to the nurturant model are they value what political scientists call bonding and bridging. So bonding is within your own group. So it's people that are like you in so many ways that you just kick your feet up on the table and relax. You feel at home there. So bonding is what we do with our own groups, sometimes called tribes and that. Bridging is when you reach out to other groups, people who are ethnically, religiously, politically different. And a number of political scientists point out that in America, there used to be a lot more bridging going on via like bowling clubs, groups that brought people who were different together. And now it's much more bonding and lack of it. But nurturants value both bonding and bridging. They think of justice, nurturers think of justice as more distributive justice. They want to make sure that all people have a solid opportunity to fulfill their potential in life. They believe that the goods and services of society should be shared rather than just a few people have access to them. And they think about religion as a pilgrimage or a quest. So one is ongoing and one has to make adaptations and adjustments as you go in life. They expect changes. So you're on your way and we haven't achieved our destination yet. And then finally, I'll say this, Christian nurturants think of the Christian community, the fellowship of Jesus, is primarily to be one of forgiveness, where forgiveness is highlighted and practiced. People are going to screw up. People are going to make mistakes. And they need forgiveness. And what happens is people need acceptance and what I call embrace in order to be transformed. So in the book, I talk about God embracing us, God showing acceptance to us, and that's been the motivation to change. God wants us to change. God has high expectations for us, both individually and corporately, and as John Cobb has written so eloquently, for the whole world. So it's a corporate, it's a communal way of life in terms of emphasis, a way of forgiveness. And so what I do in the book is I frame it around the parable of the prodigal son. So I use this parable as a lens by which to see God's fundamental way of relating to us and treating us. So in that parable, very briefly, two sons, And one says, I would like my share of the inheritance. And the father divides the estate between the two sons. Both get their inheritance. One son leaves. And there's a famine in the land where he's at, goes into a difficult situation. He's impoverished. And he realizes that his father's hired servants have enough food to eat. So he says, well, I can't be a son anymore. I have unsunned myself. And he makes his way back. And he has his speech ready. And he starts with the speech. And he says, I'm not worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired servants. And the father has none of it. He embraces the son. He lifts him up. And he tells the servants to dress him and put a robe on him, and that they're going to have a party that night. And that he frames it not as my son disobeyed, my son shamed our family. He doesn't say, he says, my son who was dead is alive. So he wants the son to change. He wants the son to be, live rightly. But to do that, God embraces. God shows forgiveness and acceptance first and expects change later. I see this in the Exodus of the book of Exodus out of Egypt. In Exodus 19, God says, you saw, Israel, how I brought you out of Egypt and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will obey my voice. So God's liberation came first. Then God called on Israel to respond. So this is a fundamental way of relating. And it's different from the authoritative way of relating, which is primarily about rules and order in society and individual responsibility. Authoritatives also are what we crave what we call cognitive closure. They want certainty. So they tend to have one view. So I call that kudzu religion. Kudzu is a plant in the southeast that takes over and ends all biodiversity, and it kills everything else. So monopolistic religion, it's one way, one doctrine, one practice, no variety, and they tend to have a fortress religion. And they define justice, and this is very key. They define justice as getting what you deserve. So there really isn't grace here. So in authoritative or authoritarian religion, the emphasis is on order, one person being in charge, telling everybody else what's right and wrong, and you're to do it. And society functions properly then when everybody is in line. So I see these two models in light of Christianity. And let me just say they're models. This doesn't mean that everyone who's authoritative has all these traits to the nth degree, infinite degree, or everyone who's nurturant has all these traits to an infinite degree. Rather, the models are prototypes. These are ideal types. And then you have variations of both types. So all in there, we can say lots more and questions from the audience, and that will be good, but I'll turn it over now to John Cobb.
Thank you, John, so much. And John Cobb, what would you like to say right now?
Well, I would first like to say that I think that this distinction is a familiar one. The use of the word nurturance is an excellent choice, and it's new to me. I don't mean I've never heard the word before, but I haven't used it, haven't heard it used in this way, and I think it's a much richer way of talking about. So I appreciate what John Sanders is doing very much, and I agree that this is fundamental to human psychology. I think I'm not quite as tolerant as he is. In my view, this is the old distinction between grace and law. And Christianity, the gospel, is for grace. Jesus and Paul are both so clear about that. Now, you might say, well, wait, oh, but they're not Orthodox Christians. Well, I get a little impatient with that. If they're not Orthodox Christians, I'd much rather be with Jesus and Paul than I would with Orthodox Christians. So I admire John's ability to say this is a form of Christianity. It's certainly a form of church life. So if we define as Christian anyone who participates in the life of the church, there's no question, but the people, we need to preach the gospel, and John is obviously doing it. So this is only a tactical matter. It's that I'm not willing to call legalism a form of the gospel. It's exactly what the gospel denied and rejected. But it's very hard for people who were brought up in a certain way and have a certain temperament to believe that. So I've gotten to use the term Christianism to refer to people who call themselves, and really, I'm not suggesting they're not sincere or anything of that sort, but their commitment is to the rightness and superiority of what they understand by Christianity, rather than to living out of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And from my point of view, the priority needs to go with the gospel and not with what the gospel overcomes. So, John, I don't think we differ really very much, and it's your ability to present what I call the legalistic form with sympathy, and individuals who are stuck in there deserve all possible sympathy. It's not their fault. I mean, in some cases, that may be to some extent their fault. But if children are brought up without unconditional love from their parents, they don't have any idea of what Christian grace is unless they learn it somewhere along the way. It makes a huge difference whether you think you have to earn God's forgiveness and God's love. And if you had to earn your parents, it's going to be very hard to sort of imagine our Father in heaven as being completely different. But nevertheless, there are people who are converted. People do find that they are accepted by God. God loves you and you can't do anything about it. That is one way of putting it. You can't stop God from loving you. Too bad if you want to, but you can't do it. And if you've had parents like that, then it's not so hard to understand and believe. And I've been very fortunate, so I take no credit for it. But it's just, to me, the heart of the gospel. Now, I liked everything you said, and I'm not going to be presenting what I want to say as if it were in any way reducing the importance of what you say. I think that when we're talking about God's grace and we're talking about Jesus' mission and what we are called to be as Christians, Nurturant is a beautiful way of describing one part of it. But by itself, it is likely to distract attention from some of the things that are most important. The word love, which is the traditional and conventional one, means so many things, and that's been used so extensively that it's important to introduce other language. And I'm going to borrow your word, nurturant. I really like it, but it doesn't replace love. From my point of view, Jesus' most distinctive teaching, and Jesus is reported to have indicated that he also thought of it that way, is that we should love our enemies. And to love your enemies or to love other people cannot always mean to nurture them. The nurture is very important in the family. It's very important in communities in which we are personally related. But in terms of a fundamental attitude toward people we have never met, I don't think it can take the place of love. And that attitude of love for everyone, everything, and the fact that it's universal is clearly expressed. Jesus says, even the Gentiles may show love to one another. But I don't think anyone can find in earlier writings, earlier sayings, a clear statement that we are to love our enemies. And Christians have not paid a lot of attention to that. But it's still the only hope for the world. You probably know, John, that for the last 50 years, I have thought the most important matter is to prevent humanity from self-destruction.
Right.
And so I measure any contribution that people make. And I think that we have a much better chance of saving the world if people can be freed, saved, I would say, from legalism and Christianism, and really, really understand the gospel and live out of the gospel. So I in no way am disparaging that, but it is only part of what love means. Martin Luther King and Gandhi were the first public figures to really pay attention to Jesus in terms of Jesus' most distinctive contribution. And I cherish that. And it has made the love of the enemy something that can really make a political difference. And I think the only hope for the salvation of humanity, and by salvation now I just mean survival of humanity, is that we stop using what resources are left to us to seek superiority over each other, or to crush others so that we may be more powerful, and so forth and so on, that we can concentrate more wealth in our hands. As long as we use what's left to us competitively, it's not enough to keep us going at all. So that to love our enemies means not to have enemies. It means to cooperate, to work with other people. And that's the only thing that can help us. I think that more people are realizing that here in California in the last few days than have really interiorized it. The people of Australia had the experience that the whole continent was burned down. We haven't had that experience, but I think people finally are understanding that unless our faith or whatever, something in us makes us willing to think in terms of radically different relationships with one another, we don't have any chance. But I think people see that with respect to California having, and Oregon and Washington, the West Coast, having enormous fires. And I think people now know next year will be worse, so at least in general. Each successive year will be worse. As long as there are any forests, they'll be burning down. We have to work together these matters. And that to me is the most practical message. And I'm afraid that it is possible even for people who receive, who are nurturant in their relationships with their family and other people in their community and so forth, can easily be swept up into the feeling, oh, the United States has to be the dominant power. We're not automatically liberated from that, even when in our more personal relationships, we are highly nurturant. So my general feeling is you are making a great contribution. I will myself make use of that. I think the word nurturant is very rich, and it has a more immediate resonance of the kind we need than just saying you should love your children. Well, of course, everybody says they love their children. But if you say you need to live, I would still hope we could sometimes use the old theological language. but I think that your use of social sciences and so forth as a way of clarifying for the modern ear is excellent. I'm not critical of the fact that the word nurture hasn't been a prominent one in the Bible so far as I know. Yeah. But it's implied. You're absolutely right. How much more time do I have, Jay?
John, that's about it for the first question.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
I thought that might be about the place
Okay.
to stop.
John Sanders, would you like to respond to what John Cobb said there? And then after that, if you would turn to that second question,
Right.
what in your view are the primary obstacles to a nurturant Christianity?
Yeah. So thank you very much, John. So let me make 3 points in response to what John said. First, he said it's a familiar distinction. So the terms aren't necessarily familiar as categories. But what I found fascinating was readers of the manuscript said, wow, I've met these people. I know these people. Yes. This is all around me. So what I've done is just give name to what I call icebergs. So these are the icebergs that we're floating in, that we are, or we're the icebergs, and we bump into each other all the time. We are somehow subconsciously or even unconsciously aware of these different ways of life. But now, one of the things I wanted to do in the book is name them, name the icebergs, so that we can then talk to one another and have a better understanding of each other. That's one goal. But my other goal is to actually persuade authorities to become nurturant and help those who are nurturant to become more thoroughly nurturant in the way they live. So that's the purpose of the book. Secondly, John asked, is authoritative religion Christian? And he thought I was saying yes, but actually in the book I say, no, it's not. It's a false gospel. And that's pretty harsh, I know. That's very strong language. But I'm fully convinced that Jesus taught and embodied the nurturant way of life and nurturant values. So I think that the authoritative religion twists the gospel and turns it into God will accept you if you change your way, if you shape up.
Yes, yes.
Then God accepts you. And people live under this incredible burden.
It is.
I just had one of my friends who read the book recently said for the first time in his life, he feels the burden is gone.
That's
of God is, because one of the things I say in the book is for authoritative religion, the little slogan is, God is watching you. For nurturant religion, God is watching out for you.
Mm-hmm.
So again, these are just slogans that are used in American society, and I try to use them to say these are two different ways of understanding God. So, so I do think that the authoritative way is wrong. It's not just that we can understand it. I believe we do need to understand and have empathy and sympathy for these people, but I think it's wrong. Then third and finally, use of the word love. Yes, I use the word love a lot in the book, and I talk about different ways people love. One of the things that a book called America's Four Gods documents, they say 85% of Americans say love is a good descriptor of God. So overwhelmingly, Americans say, yes, God loves us. The problem is authoritatives or authoritarians and nurturants or benevolence don't define love the same way. And that's what John was talking about. He was saying, yes, everybody uses the word love, but they don't mean the same thing. And so, so I agree with you. I'm not disagreeing at all. I'm actually.
I feel that we're extensively.
Okay. So authoritatives, again, are going to say, if you shape up, then I'll accept you. That's what love is. If you follow the rules, then you will be welcomed and embraced. For nurturance, I embrace you, I welcome you. If necessary, I forgive you in order for you to be empowered, to be liberated. Forgiveness is an incredible liberating gift to bring about transformation. So what are the obstacles to this way of life? So one of the courses I teach is, I teach courses on the history of Christianity. And I have come to see these two sides, these two ways of life in the history of Christianity forever. And you can go back before Abraham. You can see it in other religions. And so what the biggest obstacle, I think, is the subtlety with which the authoritative way of life claims Christianity. And the way they think of atonement, principally, and we can get into this if you want, but penal substitution, that if somebody has to be punished, God doesn't let people off for free. Somebody's got to bear the punishment.
Horrible doctrine.
Yeah. And so Jesus pays for it. Whereas nurturants have different ways of understanding the atonement of Jesus. And we could go into those. There's various ways. There's not a single way. There's a variety of ways of understanding it. So I think that the key obstacle right now, in the last decade, the tremendous resurgence of authoritative values throughout the world in both religions, I'm talking about Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, and in politics. And authoritatives have been brilliant at tapping into people's core values. They know how to promote fear, fear-mongering. They know how to say the world's a dangerous place and you have to watch out for these people. They know how to scapegoat excellently. And they have done a much better job politically and religiously of highlighting their values to people. Nurturants need to get on the stick and do a much better job. So policies are important, yes. People don't read 26-page policy papers and decide how to vote. Okay, there might be 1% of people who do that, okay? But most people don't. Instead, they hear you talking about their values. They go, oh, that resonates with my core values. That, I'm gonna vote for you. Oh, you have that policy? Yeah, I'll go with that policy. And this is where nurturants have not been very good at articulating their core values and what they stand for. And so I'm hoping that the book and that will help people do that, but also point people to other resources, especially political resources. I'm not a political scientist. And so I point them to in that direction to try and help them. So I think those are a couple of key obstacles that I believe need to have a definite challenge to overcome.
Thanks, John. I want to say to everybody watching at this moment, feel free to pose questions, and they'll be relayed to me, and I'll share them with Dr. Sanders and Dr. Cobb. So just know that you can do that. We look forward to that. John Cobb, so the second question is, what are the primary obstacles to the kind of Christianity that you would like to see emerge, however named? What are the obstacles? And also, do you have hope? Same for John Sanders.
Yeah.
You go first, John Cobb.
Okay. Well, I think that the primary obstacle we face is modernity. And the rejection in the modern world of purpose as being a part of reality. It has led, and of course this is a long and complicated story, but it has led modernity to nihilism. And nihilism, when one sees the results of cutting loose from the solid anchors, that just intensifies the commitment, and one becomes more rigid. So the alternatives that modernity presents us are nihilism and supernatural absolutism. If the natural world has no purposes. But we know purpose is extremely important. And by purpose, of course, includes our values and everything like that. So, fortunately, the world has never become completely modern. It's very interesting that until the 20th century, universities were still medieval in terms of what they taught. The Middle Ages invented universities so that they lasted. But now universities teach that there are no values that matter. We don't have to study values, or we don't have to have any. We have created a system of advancing knowledge which is only about facts. Immanuel Kant is the one who separated facts from values. We don't have time, of course, to go into any of these things, but I think they have done enormous harm. And that until we recognize, and especially in the church, the liberal Protestant churches picked up on Kant. And since Kant was personally just as interested in practical reason as he was in pure reason, that gave the churches something they could do. And it didn't matter so much whether you believed anything. You could still talk about the practical world. It's an important topic. But once you have said, of course, you're not saying anything about reality. This is the problem that we in the liberal churches have experienced. And the conservative churches have taken a different route, which I think, in fact, at least it's no worse than the liberal route. And I think there's probably more promise of coming out of the conservative churches with seriousness about theology, and then actually maybe recovering Jesus and Paul and having an alternative. But I despair of when we have an educational system that teaches people that purpose is not something worth studying in school. Values are not something worth studying in school. And we have churches that are not, certainly the liberal churches are dying. The task that is left on Christians, and let's talk about Christians coming out of the evangelical community, but understanding what the gospel is, as John Sanders does. You have to save us all. It's a big job I'm giving you. But the hope is that modernity is self-destructive, and that modernity can destroy itself without destroying all of us. It is in the process of ending. And the whole educational system is it's without any rational justification to spend all that money teaching people facts that don't even help them get jobs. But that's only one thing. The natural sciences are in real trouble. They cannot develop a coherent system because they're so committed to modern metaphysics. And I could go down the list where everything is collapsing, and the physical world is collapsing about us, and the social world is collapsing about us. So the hope is that something new will be born out of this collapse. And it's time. The gospel has never been more important. And but the obstacles are overwhelming. I have, for 50 years, been watching as we went step by step deeper into self-destruction. And I've had more hope in the last few months than I've had before. I think that finally, someone suggested it's like an alcoholic. The alcoholic knows that drinking is getting him into trouble, but still he drinks. And he has to become really desperate before he will stop drinking. Look for help. So I think it may be that the combination of the climate, the obvious awfulness of the political system, and the plague, and the knowledge that this is all going to get worse if we don't do something about it, I think it may have finally prepared us to let go of the craziness that modernity has inflicted on us. So that's my hope.
We have some questions coming in, and I'll address them. I'll share them with you in just a moment. But a word to each of you. I've read your most recent books. I've read John Cobb's Salvation, and I've read John Sanders' Embracing Prodigals. And John Sanders, you present so clearly and so helpfully a mindset which you call the authoritative mindset, juxtaposing it with the nurturant mindset. And at one stage in your book, you speak of that as a moral vision, authoritarian, you use the phrase moral vision. It has a logic to it.
Yeah.
It may be wrong, but it has a logic to it.
Yeah.
If you read John Cobb's most recent book, he too, in a way, is concerned with what you might even call a nurturant vision of the world. That is a worldview that invites a nurturant approach to life. And John's critique of the university system and other systems as well is that they actually don't offer that these days. They give us a picture of the world as a collection of facts at best, but not a community in which things have value and purpose of their own, including the more than human world. So I'm wondering, to John Sanders, is there a worldview in the authoritarian mindset? In your view, has it been accentuated by modernity or not? And to John Cobb, is there a nurturant way of living that would enrich and does enrich what you would call a more organic purpose for a worldview? So I'm trying to bring you into conversation in that way. It may or may not work, but I'll give it a shot. John, do you want to, was my question clear enough for you to respond?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So I do believe that, in fact, I'll just supplement what John Cobb said in terms of modernity. The one particular, I think, insidious form of political and economic thought is called neoliberalism. And this is the view that it's individuals who make society run. It's not communities.
Mhm.
And so they believe, for instance, that government services should be privatized rather than for the common good. It's all about making a profit. And the common good is just been set aside. The government in neoliberal economics and politics should get out of the way, no regulations, let the strong survive, and the weak have to learn to become strong. And if you get out of the way and let it's a radical form of capitalism. There's varieties of forms of capitalism. So please, I'm not saying necessarily every form of capitalism is bad, but neoliberal capitalism is, I think, a particularly insidious form arising out of what John Cobb called modernity. And this has taken hold in the United States, Great Britain, a number of other countries since the 1980s. And I think it has failed. We look at healthcare, we look at income inequality, the wealth inequality, the rapacious use, as John has said, of the natural world. I think this has to be stopped. Now, is there hope? Yes, I do think that many people are beginning to criticize. They're naming it and criticizing this view more publicly now. And the other thing I would say for hope is in my last chapter, I talk about so many younger people are leaving Christianity. They're leaving the church, in part because they identify Christianity with white evangelicalism and its politics. And they're saying, well, if I have to be an authoritative to be a Christian, then I don't want to be a Christian. So what they need to find out is, no. There's a different version of Christianity. In fact, the only version of Christianity, I think that's true. And so these people are searching for a nurturant way of, they have nurturant values, and they need to find that there is a nurturant religion. And I believe this is true in Islam. I believe it's true in Hinduism and other religions as well.
Well, whether it's true, I think different things are true of different religions. I don't think we're all the same.
No, right, no.
Situation, but there are certainly forms of Hinduism which are just making of Hinduism as such the value. And just as I was speaking of Christianism.
Yeah.
And I think this is increasing in all of the traditions. But I think we could find ourselves in considerable agreement about a lot of these matters.
Yeah.
I would say that capitalism has become even worse than you described, because even neoliberal capitalism can produce goods and increase the production of useful goods. But we now have financial capitalism. And the great fortunes that are being made now are don't involve producing anything.
Right.
It's all totally, I mean, it makes no contribution. And frankly, my hope is the financial system collapses. Iceland gives us some hope, because when Iceland faced a financial catastrophe, they refused to bail out the banks, and the banks collapsed and the economy improved. Our economy is very poor. I mean, if you compare how well China is doing with how well the US is doing, there's absolutely no indication that the American system is more productive. Every indication is that it is less so, because it's spending its time and efforts in doing things which enrich the rich, but do not. Anyway, I'm sorry, I've got these buttons, and when they get pushed, I go off on these speeches. For me, this is all theology, because it has absolutely to do with human beings, whether they are being destroyed and used simply as fodder for the machine.
Right.
So when I write a book on economics, I consider myself a Christian theologian writing a book about it. And that's not modern, but that's medieval. That's if you go back to the early days, Christians wrote about economics and about history and about politics just as much as they wrote about Jesus and God and the church. How we have allowed modernity to define us as one dealing with one narrow band of things. So we're just supposed to confine ourselves to religion, but the Bible never confines itself to religion. Religion is often what is being criticized in the Bible. The prophets are very severe critics of the festivals and the things that were the most religious expressions of the culture of the day. The people of whom Jesus was most critical were the Pharisees. They were the most religious people of the day. So to define the gospel as a religious matter, and then, well, anyway, one of the many things about modernity that we need to throw away. Yeah. And you have the job of doing that. We liberals are dying.
So no pressure, John Sanders, but just know that it's kind of all up to you, if that's okay. The liberal Protestants, there's not much hope, but the evangelicals, I don't know. Hey, let me give both of you some questions we've been getting over YouTube. Here, one's going to be, well, I'll see what you make of it. Here's the question. Is there something about Christianity that draws authoritarian personalities? Perhaps there's a misunderstanding, but is there something about Christianity such that it's a magnet for authoritarians? Either one or both of you want to take that question?
Well, I think there are some things about Christianity. I don't think there's anything about the gospel that does that. So if we say Christianity is what Christians, people who call themselves Christians through the years, have advocated. I have a friend who identifies himself as a communist and an atheist and all of those things. But he's become really very interested in Christianity. And so, but he keeps asking me, why have Christians been so brutal, so totally cruel? Well, I hate to just accept that as the definition, but I think beginning with Charlemagne, when Charlemagne persuaded his bishops to bless his rape and murder of the Saxons, then you have the Crusades. Then you have the genocide of the people in the New World and the enslavement of the people in Africa. And now you have U.S. efforts to control the world simply for the benefit of the rich. If that's what Christianity has done, he can't really dispute the fact that it has been a horrible force in the world. Now I think I have persuaded him that this is the Roman heritage rather than the Christian heritage that is primarily responsible, beginning with the creation of the Holy Roman Empire. Before then, the church had not blessed killing, but it began blessing killing. If you do it for the sake of the church, then killing is a good thing. So, and it's all right to enslave people. Those teachings don't come from the gospel. They come from Rome. And when we understand that the educational system was also looked back to the Roman Empire as the great period, and on down into the 19th century, we studied Latin. Why pick on Latin? At least we could have done Greek. The Greeks were great philosophers, but what was contributed by the Latins? Well, power. They had the power. And it was not the Christian power. It was military power, political power, just force. So we have been celebrating our Roman heritage at least as much as our Hebrew heritage. And now that we have cut our Hebrew heritage out of our schooling system altogether, nothing left but the Roman, except that we don't have that either. So that we just turn to nihilism. Anyway, I have a rather dark view of the history, and I think Anselm created a new religion. I don't think it had anything to do with the gospel. But Anselm's religion is more influential in many churches than Jesus or Paul or the Bible.
Let's give John Sanders a chance there. John, would you like to respond to that question as well?
So very briefly, so I just affirm what John has said. And the only thing I would add is that I don't believe that the gospel of Jesus and Christianity is a magnet to authoritative or authoritarianism. I believe it's anathema to that. But if you're a political figure or you just want power or control over others, religion is a very useful tool to bring that about. And you can then distort what God is like. And you can distort even what Jesus' teachings are, and you can undermine them. And that's what I think has happened. And so I don't think that Christianity per se is a magnet to authoritative, but it can be distorted and used and abused.
Maybe what John Cobb calls Christianism.
Yeah.
Would be distorted Christianity for you. Is this correct?
Yeah. So I think of Soren Kierkegaard, a 19th century Danish Christian thinker who wrote a book called Attack on Christendom. He wasn't attacking Christianity. He was attacking the form of religiosity in Denmark, in the Lutheran religiosity. And he said, this is not following Jesus. It's the same kind of thing Dietrich Bonhoeffer picks up on in his book, The Cost of Discipleship. So I see these kinds of thinking going on and criticizing that kind of religion, but I don't want to call it Christian.
Thank you, John. I want to give each of you a couple of new questions. This one, I'll just read it to you. Are there any contemporary models within the church that exemplify your vision of a nurturant Christianity?
Yeah.
Very straightforward.
Yeah. So one that
John
comes to
Sanders
mind.
first, John Cobb second. How about that?
Okay. So one that comes to mind is the Truth and Justice Commission, headed by Bishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa. And the horrible atrocities that took place under apartheid. The Truth and Justice Commission said these are wrong, these are horrible, and they have to be addressed. And they called people to hold them accountable, to confess what they had done. But then they went beyond that to seek reconciliation and forgiveness, if possible. But the people had to come forward and confess what they had done. That was part of the program. So I think that's an exemplar. Now, there are others. I'm just picking out, that was the first thing that jumped to my mind. Are there contemporary exemplars of nurturant Christianity? So that's one. I'll maybe think of another one while John Cobb is talking.
John Cobb.
Well, I think that there are lots of local churches which are nurturant. I don't think it's so rare. There may be more that are.
Yeah.
And I think I may be fortunate to be a Methodist because Wesley was definitely a nurturant leader. And one of my reasons for pointing out the limitations is that although my experience in local churches has definitely not been with the authoritarian mindset, but it has taken nurturance as the whole job of Christianity and not made it clear even why you need any particular beliefs or any particular tradition. You know, it's just become a value in itself. And the church, even though what it does is nurturant 1 hour a week, it is a rather minimum contribution to the total life of people. So that it has not shown the importance of what it was doing. I think what nurturant congregations are still doing is still very important, but they don't even know that it's important. So I don't think that it's so difficult. Come to the Claremont. I mean, I'm not saying my congregation is a wonderful congregation. I think it's a great congregation. I'm very happy with it. But it doesn't it does not deal well with the desperate psychological, sociological problems that we face. I think the people who participate in it are helped, but they hardly know that the gospel has anything to do with the help that they receive. So liberals have tended to be more nurturant, but something more is needed than the way they have done that. So that's my reason for starting about that. You're absolutely right, and I appreciate what you say very much. But it needs to be understood that being nurturant is a way of life that is grounded in the gospel. And when you just try to ground it in modern science or in psychology, it doesn't do the trick, and it doesn't deal with the real issues that people face. And it's so I mean, the fact that liberal Christians have allowed an educational system that was once favorable to Christianity to become anti-Christian without organizing any kind of effort to check that is a sign that the nurturance alone is not enough. You've got to have some understanding of how that relates to social structures, to basic ideas.
John Sanders.
So Jay, can I just add
Yeah,
one more?
please, go ahead.
So in the book, I do list a number of authors that I believe are promoting nurturant Christianity. There are hundreds of them.
Yes.
So it's not just a few, but I think of Franciscan Richard Rohr, Episcopalian Nadia Weber-Bolz, Brian McLaren, Phyllis Tickle, N.T. Wright, Rachel Held Evans. So there's many people. They don't use the terms nurturant and authoritative, but I believe they are promoting a nurturant Christianity. When I read their books, they're all criticizing these same things, and they're promoting these things, but they don't use the categories. But there are lots of bloggers and websites and books that people can tap into to help them live more nurturantly.
John Sanders, this is kind of a John Cobb question to you. You've read John Cobb's or looked at John Cobb's book, Salvation, and you realize that part of his profound concern is saving the world from self-destruction. And he thinks that that's Jesus's, that's the calling of Abba to us, if we're faithful to Jesus. I can understand how John Cobb might hear the word nurturance and miss that prophetic dimension, that side of nurturance that is self-critical not only of individuals and communities, but self-critical of American policy, self-critical of modernity. So I want to give you a chance here, if it's honest, if it's true. Does nurturance, in your view, the nurturant Christianity, include a prophetic dimension that reaches out beyond the confines of local communities and family structure toward these structural broader issues?
Yes, and the framework for that is sometimes people think of nurturant people as permissive. Anything goes. But love is evaluative. Love doesn't say to the beloved, oh, whatever you do is okay, I don't care. No, love wants the best for the beloved. So love has to evaluate. Parents evaluate their children. And a nurturant parent is going to evaluate their children and say, no, don't live this way. Don't treat that person this way. Don't do that. So it involves evaluation and it involves judgment. Now I realize the word judging can bring up bad connotations for some people, and Jesus said, don't judge. But I'm saying you have to be evaluative. Anyway. So then we have to be evaluative, not just on individual matters, but I agree with John that we have to be evaluative of ecological matters, huge world-changing matters. So we have to evaluate, we have to have conversations and dialogue and debate about what needs to be done, the best way forward. So I'll stop with that.
I got you. Yeah, I hear you. Yeah. We have about 10, 12 minutes left. And there's one more question that's come to me. I'm seeing our discussion, by the way, it's been great. And thank you both. John Sanders, you have had to represent evangelical Christianity, even though you're about a lot more than that. And John Cobb, you represented liberal Protestant Christianity, even though you're about a lot of things besides that. But the question is directed in a way toward evangelicals. I'll read it directly and then you can interpret it as you will and respond as you wish. If evangelicalism is what evangelicals believe and act upon, are evangelicals losing the good news? If so, what is the path for returning evangelicals to the good news?
So that's one of the things. Go ahead, John.
No, I just said writing books like yours is that.
Well, that's indeed one of the purposes. I'm not just writing to evangelicals, but a lot of my experience, I've taught at evangelical colleges for many, many years. And I have participated in evangelical theological life for decades. So I understand it well, and I seek to address it. And I can address it using the language of an insider. I understand the reasoning. I understand what evangelicals will find persuasive. And so I'm trying to write to them. That's part of the value of the book. So I'm trying to remember now how the question was phrased here. Can evangelicals be redeemed? Or
Well, I think it comes to that. Yes, I think it
Yeah.
comes to that. Yes.
Yeah. And so do I have hope? Well, because I believe in a God who never gives up, yes, I have hope. But it's a serious challenge because authoritative religion has overtaken white evangelicalism in an incredibly deep and powerful way. And they have thought it out immensely well. And they have defended it. And they have great apologists for the position. So it will take a lot to overcome this. But I want to present an alternative. And it's not just me. There are thousands upon thousands of Nurturant writers and speakers and people in churches who are modeling a Nurturant way of life. So this can be attractive. And this is one of the ways I bring out an example in the book of a young woman, actually as a child, she was raised in the Westboro Baptist Church, which for those of you who don't know, this is a very tiny congregation, but everybody's heard of it because they carry around flags, God hates gays, and they protest at the funerals of military personnel. And they say, this is God's judgment on America for being the way we are. So what happened was she was brought up to believe that outsiders hated her and nobody would ever show her any respect or dignity or love outside of their little tiny congregation. The congregation says their little motto is, it's simple. God loves us and hates you. So she was online presenting her views on the church's views on these things. And lots of people responded to her with anger and hatred and vile responses. And of course, she's like, yep, that's exactly what I was taught is going to happen. But one person, I believe it was a Jewish religious person, reached out and empathetically said, so why do you believe this particular thing? And a genuine question. And that led to other questions. And she began talking, and this person interacted with her. And over a course of about a year, she realized, I don't believe what I was raised to believe anymore. And that was very difficult for her because it meant her parents would no longer have anything to do with her. And she left that congregation and found a nurturing way of life. So it can be done. It takes a lot of work and effort for strongly authoritative people to be transformed, but it happens.
You know, John Sanders, that story reminds me of the theme that John Cobb lifts up, love your enemy. And what does that actually look like?
Yeah.
What does that really mean?
Yeah.
And surely at least one thing it means is perspective taking and being willing to put yourself inside the shoes of another whose views you may despise.
Yeah.
But you give them the dignity of saying, I care about how you look at the world.
Yeah.
You talk, I'll listen. And that's a radical act. That's a radical act. John Cobb, John is 95 years old, and he keeps saying he's written his last book. But I don't believe that. Um, but in your book, Salvation, John, you had a fairly bleak view of where humanity's headed, and a very strong call for a gospel, for people to actually follow Jesus. And you lifted up love your enemy as one of the key dimensions of what that means to follow Jesus. Would you like to say a word about the Christian life, the gospel lifestyle, and the role that loving your enemy takes? You want to say a further word about that, or will you say a further word about that?
Well, the thesis of the book is that Jesus was playing the messianic role, and he thought that to be messianic in Israel at that time was to show a way of dealing with the Romans that would overcome the oppression that the Jews experienced, but would do so not by violence, and not by hating them, but by loving them. And of course, he didn't succeed. And I think he understood he didn't succeed. He thought that he'd had a lot of success in Galilee, but he had to have the temple authorities on his side. And of course, they crucified him instead. So I think we also are not likely to really be successful. But what Jesus did was eminently worthwhile, even though the direct goal was not achieved. And if it had been achieved, then there would have been many more communities, like the communities that did grow up. But those communities did grow up. They did not take part in the revolt against Rome, and they became the model for a church that has had billions of followers. And with all of my criticisms of it, I think it has prevented us from forgetting Jesus altogether. And I think that what needs to happen to save the world is that communities of people become real communities, taking care of each other. Local communities some of them can survive all kinds of things. Some of them have a real, if they exist and are able to take care of themselves. And of course, that's morally and spiritually and physically. Many of them will survive what is beginning to actually happen. That is terrible losses in the field of the natural world. And I think that's the most let's aim at not having any more. Right, let's aim at not having the rest of the trees in California burn down. I really want to save them, but I don't think I will. But there is a movement toward mutual responsibility and adopting a different lifestyle, and the localism of the new movement, and so the exact opposite of all that modernity was imposing upon us. So I think that there are lots of individual people who are already benefiting from seeking to find a way of living that can survive. And that's analogous to what Jesus did. I mean, I think he would have really loved to have changed the relationship between Jews and Romans. The example of the soldier who had the legal right to make you carry his burdens for a mile. And Jesus said, go within 2 miles. Well, I think that's a transformative action, but very, very difficult to get a mass of people to adopt that. But if a few 100,000, if a few million do, they will in a way survive. And in the meantime, they will have a blessed life. So I don't feel that the unlikelihood of our actually preventing the weather from getting hotter and hotter and massive famines, which are almost certain to come, maybe a nuclear war. But let's at least imagine an alternative to all that and live it. So that's what my book wants, is calling for.
I see your books, both of your books have enriched me, and I'm sure many others. And John Sanders, I want to thank you for such a great book and for giving us language that can give us direction. And some of us may have already been in the nurturant world, so to speak, but you help us understand what's going on. And so I'd like for you just to have the last word and tell us what your questions are from here. Where do you go from here with your work? Now, granted that John Cobb has told you that it's all on you to save everybody. We'll accept that agenda. But do you have more modest aspirations as well? What's the next step for you now?
Yeah. So I'm hopeful that I'll be able to have more conversations. For instance, there are Sunday schools, church groups, reading groups in various Christian communities that are reading the book, and I will be interacting with them online. I'm hoping that it'll have an impact even in our political realm. I mean, it's not, whole book isn't on politics, but as John Cobb said, it's really about Jesus to shape politics, to side with the virtues and values of Jesus. And I'm talking to a group that is involved with training candidates, political candidates, about how to talk about their Christian faith to people. And they see my book as a way, a venue for doing that. And so I may be participating more in that realm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, may you do so, and may it succeed. And thank you very much to both of you. Thanks to everybody listening in tonight. I hope you've learned something, and take what you learn and move forward in the best way you can, and we'll do the same. So to all, a good night. Good night, John Cobb. Good night, John Sanders. Good night, everybody. Take care.
Good night, Jay McDaniel.
Yeah.